across America. Live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. It is a Tuesday edition of Point of View. Just a great opportunity to look at a number of issues in the news. Going to start off by talking about affordability, because that is certainly one of the themes that is going to run through the midterm elections. Also want to get into some others. We've had Gatsad on the program. He talks about misguided empathy, which is interesting because he's looking at that from one point of view, and Ali Bestucky wrote a best-selling book called Toxic Empathy, so we'll get into that a little bit later. Then I do want to come back to the whole issue of gerrymandering. I've posted a piece by Kevin McCullough. There have been some very interesting comments by, again, George Washington University law professor Jonathan Turley about what is going on there, and a couple of other topics that we will try to cover in the first hour. Second hour, we're going to spend some time talking with former Judge Michael Warren about his book, The Revolutionary Words That Forged America, the Definitive Guide to the Declaration of Independence. And when he says definitive, he's not kidding. 450 pages, and we will certainly try to do it justice as we talk about the Declaration, because once again, we're in our theme of America 250. So we'll get into that in just a few minutes. First of all, let's talk about what it costs for you just to keep food on the table, to pay for food, rent, and fuel. And a lot of that gets back to the fact that I'm now pulling this from the New York Times article. Inflation accelerates after weeks of war in Iran. No real surprise, but what we've seen is a sharp increase in energy costs due to the war that has been taking place. And so if you use the Consumer Price Index, which, again, we've admitted before is somewhat flawed, nevertheless, it rose 3.8% in April compared to a year ago. Now, the primary reason for that now is energy prices, but nevertheless, in the past, some of that was due to Mr. Trump's tariffs. I will get to that a little bit later because that is my commentary today called Tariffs and Tax Refunds. So we'll get to that in due course, but let's just take that as it is. And certainly the biggest increase is the issue of energy. And interestingly enough, that has reached about $4.50 a gallon as a national average. Some may be higher where you are, some may be lower, which is why the president talked about the idea of suspending the 18.4 cent a gallon federal excise tax on that. I think that has nowhere to go but down, if for no other reason than the fact that it would be seen as a gimmick. And I think it's important to recognize, and even the New York Times reminds us, interestingly enough, that, and I guess it was even the Wall Street Journal remind us, that when John McCain was running in 2008, he was talking about having some kind of gas tax holiday, and that was seen as a gimmick. Of course, I think most people knew that the attempt by President Biden to actually take all gasoline out of the strategic reserve was another gimmick, and I see these gimmicks being presented all the time. But I thought for just a few minutes I would give you at least one article that appears in the National Review, 5 ways Republicans can bring down gas prices and reclaim the affordability mantle. Now, the first one he mentions is the idea of a gas holiday, but in some cases he's looking at what is actually happening in the states. He reminds us, for our listeners in Mississippi, you have the nation's lowest gas taxes, which is 21 cents a gallon. For our listeners in California, I don't think that surprises you, have the highest at 71 cents per gallon. Now, again, those taxes are used to help rebuild roads and a variety of other things. But if you did have a gas tax holiday, whether a federal one or a state one, it would bring the cost down. But again, it's a reminder that when you pay for gasoline, oftentimes you're just paying for the taxes on the gasoline. Although I think it is also true, as I'm looking this up, you can read it for yourself, that even the production of gasoline in Mississippi is a bit cheaper as well. So that's the first one. The second one was to actually have the EPA, and that is, I think, a real possibility because the EPA administrator right now is Lee Zeldin, to actually grant more small refinery exemptions, especially when it has to do with some of these waivers on ethanol. This goes back to, again, the attempt to have at least half of America's corn, which is used to produce not corn that you eat, but corn ethanol, which you put in your gas tank. And so in some respects, that is, I think, another creative and suggestive idea. Number 3 was additional ideas about looking at some of the Biden-era provisions that would actually find ways that you could begin to save billions of dollars by loosening some of the monitoring requirements right now in the EPA. And I do believe there's going to be some pressure on Lee Zeldin, who's the EPA administrator, to actually see if he can implement some of those. Number 4 has to do with all the way back to President Barack Obama, in which we had Tier 3 gasoline sulfur standards, which again shows some ways in which we could reduce the cost of gas that you pay for. And finally, number 5, to actually look at some of the barriers to energy production that could be removed. This would be some things in which right now permitting sometimes should take, some people estimate, maybe 28 days. In many cases, it takes up to 4 years. So these are some, I think, creative suggestions which illustrate, again, that when it comes time for people voting right now in these primaries or in the November election, a lot of people are going to be thinking about whether or not they want to elect this person to Congress or to the governorship based on issues of affordability. And affordability has not exactly been an issue that the Trump administration or even many of the Republicans have wanted to run on, but this was at least a concrete and creative way to begin to address that. So I thought I'd bring that up because I do believe this issue of affordability is going to be with us for some time. There's some very good reasons for that. If you haven't noticed, we're still not getting quite a lot of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and that is affecting not only commodities like oil, but commodities like fertilizer and a variety of others, which can affect everything from energy prices to food prices. And so there are some people that have at least put together some ideas about what can be done. We'll see over the next couple of weeks whether that is the case, but I do believe that, as we said really almost this time last year, that this really significant issue in these 2026 elections is going to be the issue of affordability. And with the war in Iran, with the Strait of Hormuz somewhat limited in terms of what can get out, and in terms of even the previous tariffs, that has not bode well for some of the individuals that would be running under the auspices of Donald Trump and keeping Republicans in control of both the House and the Senate. So, first article, just back to kitchen table issues. How much does it take to keep the lights on, to put gas in your car, and to pay your family and pay your rent? All of that is really important. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably heard the phrase, the government giveth and the government taketh away. That's an apt description of taxes and tariffs in 2026. Many Americans have been pleasantly surprised by the tax refunds they received this year because of the tax cuts inserted into the One Big Beautiful Bill. No taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security provided many Americans with a significant check from the IRS. Unfortunately, while the government was putting money back in the pockets of U.S. taxpayers with tax refunds, it was also taking money out through tariffs that increase prices that Americans pay. Former Senator Phil Gramm is one of the co-authors of the Trump tax increase of 2026. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the taxes implemented during the Trump administration will generate $331 billion this year, but the new tax cuts will only save taxpayers $230 billion. One of the themes of this election is affordability, By October, the office estimates that these new tariffs will cost American consumers and businesses $443 billion, while the tax cuts will have provided them $379 billion. One question that is always asked about tariffs is who pays? The CBO estimates that businesses are absorbing about 30% of the cost of tariffs. Consumers are paying the remaining 70%. Another question is, how will this affect the midterm elections? Defenders of the tariff policies argue that these tax cuts provide new benefits, perhaps, but voters have short memories. Affordability is a major issue, especially with the Iran war's impact on supply chains. The president's tariffs have made prices higher. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let's, if we can, for just another minute or two, talk about the impact that tariffs are having. My commentary today is entitled Tariffs and Tax Refunds. And I start out by saying, you probably heard the phrase, the government giveth and the government taketh away. And that really has been kind of an apt description of what has happened here in 2026. Because most Americans have been pleasantly surprised by the tax refunds that they have received. And hopefully you've received yours by now. That has come in large part from some of the tax cuts that were inserted into the one big, beautiful bill. But, and first of all, let me stay on that. No taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security, as well as a couple of other things in terms of depreciation really are significant. So many people may have received a check from the IRS. So that's the government giveth. The government taketh away comes from the fact that while the government was putting money in your pockets, in some respects it was also taking money out through the tariffs that increased. Now, a lot of people will say, well, is this just coming from people that don't like Donald Trump? Well, one of the authors that I quote is from former Senator Phil Gramm, who's a Republican. He may or may not like Trump, but he's honest with the facts, so is his co-author. And if you simply look at the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office, which is supposed to be nonpartisan. Sometimes it skews a little one way or another, but nevertheless, they figure that in some respects, the tariffs during this time in 2026 have generated about $331 billion as a few weeks ago when this study was done. And the tax cuts save about $230 billion. So we're off by about $100 billion. If this plays out by October, the numbers are even more stark in terms of more money coming out from tariffs than money coming in from tax refunds. Now, the question you might have is, well, who pays for that? Because the argument always being made by the president and many of his supporters is, well, the companies pay that or the foreign producers pay that. Well, again, the Congressional Budget Office recognizes that maybe businesses have absorbed about 30% of the cost of tariffs, but the remaining, 70% has been something that we pay in higher prices. Now, some of those tariffs have languished because of the Supreme Court decision on that, and then they tried to implement some others, and there have now been some questions as to whether or not that is allowed as well. But I think it just gets back to this issue of affordability. If indeed people vote their pocketbooks, and they do so often, by the way, then that is, I think, an issue. And so if you are concerned about this issue of affordability, we're only talking now in May, and some, of course, have voted in the primaries, and it's a long way from May to October and November because people start voting in October, which is why I'm talking about October. So it's possible that some of the affordability issues will fade away, or some of the things we mentioned just a minute ago will be implemented, but it is something to pay attention to, and of course we will pay attention to it here on Point of View. So if you want to read the first article by Andrew Follett or my commentary, they're both available at the website, pointofview.net. New book out by Gat Sad. He's been on the program with us before numerous times, and the book is entitled Suicidal Empathy, Dying to Be Kind. Now, he uses the phrase suicidal empathy. If you're familiar at all with Allie Beth Stuckey, who used to be one of the roundtable guests here on Point of View, now works at The Blaze, she has a book that came out with the title Toxic Empathy. I heard her recently in an interview say that really wasn't the title for my book, but the publisher picked that title, and of course it illustrates again that sometimes you can have empathy, but you can maybe go too far. And Gat Sad looks a lot of this from an evolutionary point of view. So just a disclaimer that if you read through his article, which is well written, he's going to, in some respects, give you an evolutionary perspective. We're going to look at it from a Christian perspective. We don't believe that we're an evolutionary product. We're created in God's image, but we do have emotions. God has given us those emotions, and that is the case. But he points out that if you look at some of these historical novels and even some of these historical treatises, they all point to the fact that sometimes civilizations die from suicide, not murder. He quotes from Arnold Toynbee, the British historian, quotes from James Burnham, Suicide of the West, in which in some respects we do it to ourselves. And he says empathy is one of those human emotions that can misfire. It can malfunction. And he uses a different example to get the point across. Anger. Well, anger can be a very useful emotion. If somebody attacks you, your anger, your fight or flight syndrome will help protect you and your family. And so we recognize that sometimes fear and anger are helpful. But if a person is, he said, insanely angry all the time, then he needs to enroll in anger management classes. Likewise, we have other emotions as well. Sometimes positive emotions or negative emotions can go awry. Sometimes when they are used so that we do not necessarily employ our reasonable faculty, and so we are driven by our emotions rather than by first principles and by critical thinking and logic, which we try to talk about so much here on the program, you can see the problem. And so he points out that emotional dysregulation, in other words, poor regulation, is the feature of many psychiatric disorders. Too much anxiety, too much sadness can lead to depression. For example, hyperactivity can lead to ADHD and OCD, and he gives you lots of examples of that, in which he simply points out that, if anything, we should recognize that we should have empathy for people around us. But oftentimes, in order to enact, especially some of the more liberal, progressive ideas, what oftentimes is used is to play upon your emotions and to say, well, because these people are homeless, then we need to provide them a constant source of income. That if we are concerned about anybody that has faced some kind of financial difficulty, that we need to step in and fix it for them. And those ideas, as important as they might be for us to want to minister, go contrary to even biblical ideas, which of course is not in his piece because he's looking at it primarily from an evolutionary point of view. But think about the fact that the scriptures themselves talk about the fact that the ruin of the poor is their poverty. You see this in the Proverbs. In other words, sometimes the reason people are poor is because they have bad ideas. Matter of fact, this idea of gluttony and laziness and neglect are certainly themes that run through the Proverbs as to why some people might be poor. You even have in the New Testament, those who will not work will not eat. Doesn't say those who cannot work, but it is, I think, a reminder that sometimes we should not only reach out with compassion towards individuals who have put themselves or have been put in difficult situations, but we also should exercise what you might call tough love. In some cases, say, you would be better if you were to clean up your act, if you were to focus on the right principles, if you would stop using drugs, stop being an alcoholic, stop being lazy, stop eating as much, using as much, spending more on your credit card, whatever the phrase might be. And so the idea that he's pointing out here is that not only do we see this with individuals, which Hallie Beth Stuckey called toxic empathy, but we also see this at a nationwide level, suicidal empathy. And so he takes it one step further, and that is one famous quote from Arnold Toynbee was this: civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. Or even the one I mentioned a minute ago, James Burnham, it may be added that suicide is probably more frequent than murder as the end phase of civilization. Interesting enough, the title of his book from 1964, I remember it, The Suicide of the West. So whether you look at it individually, as Hallie Beth Stuckey looks at it and talks about how sometimes misguided or even toxic empathy justifies things that really from a rational point of view make no sense, or whether you look at the fact that we as a culture have developed what he calls suicidal empathy, it is something to pay attention to. So you might want to read the book, but this particular article I've posted is actually an excerpt from the book, which was provided by the particular imprint of HarperCollins called Broadside. So if you'd like to read it, it's a reminder that we need to make sure that we certainly have emotions, but we don't let that prevent us from making wise and rational decisions about policies and procedures so that we can have human flourishing in the future. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's, if we can, get into a couple of other issues, and one of those is the state of Virginia. Commonwealth of Virginia originally had a 6-5 split in terms of the congressional districts, and the argument that was made by the incoming governor is we would not gerrymander those districts, and as soon as she had power, they did. And as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, it was gerrymandered so much that it ended up being 10-1. One Republican district and 10 Democratic districts. And as we mentioned on Friday briefly, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that as unconstitutional, wisely so. We had talked about what Jonathan Turley had said, and I'm going to quote from him again in just a minute, but that is only the beginning, because it leads then to a piece that I've posted here by Kevin McCullough, Why Democrats Ignore Rules. Now, again, we're going to look at his piece in which he talks about how Democrats have kind of an end justifies the means mindset. Do Republicans? Yes, they do. We've talked about that before. And matter of fact, oftentimes when they are engaged in that kind of utilitarian idea, they're usually called out for it. Democrats, nobody's afraid, almost everybody's afraid to say that. And the best way to illustrate this is to say, okay, now that the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that you went from a 6-5 to a 10-1, which even if they had been maybe smart, maybe they could have made it, I don't know, a 7-4 or something like that, 8-3, something along those lines, but a 10-1, that was so extreme. And so they immediately, that is the Democrats first in the state of Virginia and even in Washington, D.C., including House Democrat leader Hakeem Jeffries, who really wants to be the next Speaker of the House, came up with another scheme, and that is, let's just get rid of all those justices. Now, how would they do that? Well, they came up with this idea that you would then have a mandatory retirement age, which right now is at 73, and bring it down to 54, which just so happens to be the age of the youngest justice who is in the majority to strike down the Democrats' gerrymandered map. And so, as Gary Bauer points out, you want to talk about an all-out attack on the rule of law. Instead of trying to pass their new map legally, they want to just simply get rid of the state Supreme Court by coming up with this pretext. And that has led to all sorts of comments. And let me first of all go to Kevin McCullough and then to Jonathan Turley. Kevin McCullough, of course, he would be a supporter of the Republican views and Donald Trump probably generally. He's been on the program with us, and you've heard him before. But he points out that there has been a characteristic of the American left, and that is if they lose an election, well, the system is broken. If the court rules against them, the court is illegitimate. If constitutional checks prevent them from getting what they want immediately, well, then the checks themselves must be removed. Not debated, removed, and he says, well, that brings us to Virginia. Following Virginia Supreme Court's rejection of the Democratic-backed gerrymandered effort, voices on the left are now floating the idea of court packing at the state level, which I think gives you a preview of what could happen if Democrats take control of the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, but I'll leave it at that. And he talks about the idea that instead of trying to make a better case, they just want to purge the court itself. And he says, just think how insane that actually is. Not that we disagree with the ruling, not we'd like to challenge the reasoning. No, we just think that if the institution won't obey us, we'll actually replace the institution. And he says that Jonathan Turley rightly pointed out the danger of this mentality, which brings me to a piece that came out just the other day. He was, again, just for you that don't remember, Jonathan Turley is a legal expert. He's a law professor at George Washington University. I think on numerous occasions he says he always has voted for a Democrat, so it's not like he's in the pocket of Republicans. But nevertheless, he was responding to this phone call that was held by some of the top Democrats after the Virginia Supreme Court struck down this heavily gerrymandered congressional map. And he again took on this whole issue in which he said that this is indicative of a party right now that seems to hold no American institution or political value sacred. Here's the actual quote from Jonathan Turley. Quote, well, you know, I wrote about this not because I think that it's likely to succeed, but this sack and pack proposal really captures this age of rage. which, by the way, is the title of his newest book that I have on my shelf. It captures the fact that now many on the left are saying that we will win by any means necessary, again, a utilitarian calculation. The ends justify the means. Jonathan Turley goes on to say, quote, and this is a very important issue for Hakeem Jeffries. He's very unpopular with most people in the country, but he hopes to be the next Speaker of the United States. But in order to do that, he's got to engineer a majority, and he's got to get Democrats there in the House to vote for him, and he's watching that evaporate across the country. And so certainly that is the case. That's where he goes on to then say a little bit later that the Supreme, shows you what they might want to do if they have the Supreme Court. He says, quote, it's the same mindset of by any means necessary, no institution, no value is truly sacred. Pretty strong comments from Jonathan Turley, but let me come back real quickly to this piece that is by Kevin McCullough, because he points out something else that we really didn't talk about at the time, and that is, obviously, we had people vote, if you will, on this specific change in the Virginia Constitution, which would then allow them to gerrymander these districts, because up until that time, they actually had an independent organization do that. And so they did that, and I had forgotten about this, but again, kudos to Kevin McCullough for digging it out. This all happened in what's called, I think, honestly, a low turnout election. Because it was a special election, you are changing something in the Constitution, including this idea of redistricting, by the very few votes. Matter of fact, it was very close, by the way. It just barely passed. But more importantly, the argument, well, the people voted, well, that's pretending that a low turnout cycle election somehow represents, he says, an unquestionable, overwhelming moral mandate, while simultaneously dismissing the constitutional role of the Virginia Supreme Court as intellectually dishonest. So he had reminded me of something else, because the argument sometimes comes back, well, the people voted in the election, so their vote should stand. Well, we don't live in that rule. There are times when individuals and people and voters have voted, and the Supreme Court or the state courts have struck that down, and that's because we have what? Checks and balances. But even more so when it just barely passed in a low turnout special election, all the more to say, yes, the very few people that voted, yes, they did vote, but this is not exactly the same. He says this is not democracy failing. It's the constitutional order functioning properly. He says the reason so many activists on the left ignore rules is because they no longer believe, and here's the key point, in objective morality at all. Rules are not viewed as fixed principles rooted in enduring truths. They are viewed as what? Temporary tools, useful when they produce desired outcomes, disposable when they do not. The concept that he's pointed out here is there's no stable principle underneath this power. Acquire it, protect it, expand it. And if the rules interfere with those objectives, then the rules themselves become obstacles to eliminate. Checks, balances, competing branches, Constitution restraints, not to frustrate democracy, but to preserve liberty, because liberty without restraint eventually collapses into coercion. And coercion is precisely where radical political movements always drift when they stop believing truth exists beyond their own desires. And he says that's what makes the Virginia situation so revealing. And so you see the whole discussion of, well, maybe it's just time to completely restructure the court itself. Will actually require those who were supposed to retire at the age of 73, now if they're 54 or older, they have to retire. And so when one branch of government disappoints you, well, you just simply replace it. That's not constitutional government. And so, as he points out, the issue isn't necessarily even the maps. The issue is whether or not we as Americans still believe in the constitutional restraints, even when they apply and when they are applied, even when they prevent us from sometimes getting what we want immediately. Of course, we'll get into this in much more detail in the next hour when we talk about the Declaration of Independence with Judge Michael Warren. But I think it was a great reminder that in some respects, what we're seeing in Virginia is an end justifies the mean, power at any cost, even if we have to get rid of justices on the Virginia Supreme Court. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me again say that tomorrow we will be getting into some very important issues that I think you will appreciate. Some of our guests will talk about everything from the interaction between the president and the Pope to a variety of other very interesting topics that we will be addressing. And so I hope you'll join us then. And in the next hour, we're going to be getting into the Declaration. I might just hold up our booklet that we have made available to you. This one came out just in April, and if you haven't received a copy, we certainly could get one to you, but we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence in very significant ways. I'll hold up the book, 450 pages, just everything and more that you'd ever want to know about the Declaration, and really breaks it down line by line. And I think if you really wanted to get a sense of why we are so enamored with the Declaration, I think you will begin to discover that as we break down some of these important principles that were put in the Declaration in 1776. But just before we take a break, I thought it would be good to end on this hour with a very good piece by Tony Morley. He is an individual who has been watching what is happening in the West. And just a few minutes ago, of course, I talked about Gat Sad, who is himself concerned about the suicide of the West, concerned about the fact that oftentimes cultures tend to commit suicide rather than are murdered. And in some respects, this fits perfectly with Tony Morley, because he says, look, the values of the West built the prosperity that we enjoy today in civilization. Tomorrow, we're going to talk a little bit about, for example, I've got a quote or two from Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and also some from Howard Schultz. So I'm going to give you kind of a counterpoint. Did billionaires make their money legally or illegally? Should people have that much money? Shouldn't we actually tax them to the hilt? And what should we do if they actually decide to leave Seattle, New York, whatever it might be? And I think there's a sense in which that comes back to this idea as well. We have so many people today that are enjoying the fruits of a free enterprise system, enjoying the fruits of the Reformation and the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, who today want to, in a sense, take us back to the Dark Ages and want to implement socialist policies at every turn. And Tony Morley says, the past decade has seen many in the West engaged in an unprecedented campaign of cultural self-flagellation and a rejection of Western and Enlightenment values. That the West is good rather than evil has become morally suspect at best and grounds for threats and violence at the worst. And he says, polarized critics, from within perceive the downfall of the West, preaching inequality, down with imperialism, tax the rich, environmental apocalypse, racial injustice, and systematic oppression, fascism, and 100 other pessimistic railings of the self-proclaimed champions of the proletariat. That's Tony Morley. Well, he goes on to say, from without, of course, you also have hostile foreign nations and countless proponents of anti-Western ideologies, burning flags, calling for death to America, the West, the rich, the free, and really denounce everything that the West represents. And so he reminds us that if we look through history, when you get to the Reformation and then the Enlightenment, you begin to see the rise of modern science. You see, of course, the rise of what was the beginning of a free market culture, the rise of so many things that happened. And he points out that it set European culture on a process of transformation from totalitarian monarchies and oppressive religious dogma to scientific rationalism, freedom, commerce, tolerance, and even just this idea of progress. And then points out something that we've talked about many times before. Between 1800 and 2025, the average global life expectancy climbed from 28 years to roughly 73 years, while extreme poverty fell from roughly 80% to about 10%. And he says over that same period, global child mortality, even in the poorest countries, plummeted from a little over 40% to 3.5%. By nearly every objective measure, he says, living standards and the quality of life improved for the average citizen globally from the United States to Uzbekistan. And he says this is part of the problem. We've become too detached from the cultural norms, the institutions, the systems, and the values that created the wealth, prosperity, and high living standards of the West that have largely forgotten that they were the prime movers and the driving forces in building that abundance. He focuses, for example, on capitalism, property rights, constitutional government, individual liberty, free markets, entrepreneurship, family values, the rule of law, and a belief that the future can and should be better than the past. These are values, he says, that make up a broader cultural system that is not just one of the many good cultures and societal systems, not a culture on par with others, but thus the best system of civilization humanity has ever had. And I think, again, if you have been listening to Point of View, even back in the days when Marlon Maddox was the host, we pointed so often to the kind of negativity in the college classrooms, which now has made its way out into the media and into the culture at large, in which no longer can we celebrate America? No longer can we celebrate the West. No longer can we celebrate the positive impact that Christianity has had on civilization. And as a result, he says, we've been goaded, bullied, threatened, and canceled into turning our backs on these values. And again, those values were all sorts of things like capitalism and a free market and property rights and entrepreneurship and family values and the rule of law. And if there's one thing that we are dedicated to doing here on Point of View, it is to once again point back to those values, because so many of those values are rooted in a biblical foundation. And once the culture rejects the Bible, once the culture rejects even the idea of absolute moral ideas, once the culture rejects the idea of the Western culture that we live in, we are seemingly headed back to some of the dark ages. As one of my booklets points out, this comes from Glenn Sunshine, if you really want to understand Western culture, it was Rome plus Christianity that gave you Western culture. And now that the culture is getting rid of Christianity, we're turning back to Rome, and that's not a good thing. So he says, again, these values of the West don't survive the next century if we don't uphold them. And so if we don't, then economic growth will contract, progress and living standards will falter, and the specters of autocracy, war, hunger, ignorance, illness, and poverty will rise again. So he concludes by saying, it's time for returning to respectfully saying the West is good. Very good piece. Just thought you might want to see how significant that is. And it's a perfect lead-in to our conversation next hour. We maybe take for granted 1776, maybe take for granted the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and this republic we have. But I think as we dig into this a little bit more with Judge Michael Warren, we're going to learn a little bit more about some of the genius that was found in that document, the Declaration of Independence. Let's take a break. If you'd like to get a copy of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, of course, we're still making that available to you. Just go to the website, pointofview.net, click on that banner. We'd be glad to send it to you. We'll be talking about it next hour. Good example of why you need to get a copy right now. We'll be back after this.
In 19th century London, two towering historical figures did battle, not with guns and bombs, but words and ideas. London was home to Karl Marx, the father of communism, and legendary Baptist preacher Charles Spurgeon. London was in many ways the center of the world, economically, militarily, and intellectually. Marx sought to destroy religion, the family, and everything the Bible supports. Spurgeon stood against him, warning of socialism's dangers. Spurgeon understood Christianity is not just religious truth, it is truth for all of life. Where do you find men with that kind of wisdom to stand against darkness today? Get the light you need on today's most pressing issues delivered to your inbox when you sign up for the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Every weekday, in less than 2 minutes, you'll learn how to be a person of light to stand against darkness in our time. It's free, so visit pointofview.net/signup right now. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this. Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about the Declaration of Independence. I'll hold up for those of you watching online the latest booklet that we had that came out on April, A Biblical View on the Declaration. And we begin with, of course, this famous statement by G.K. Chesterton: America is the only nation in the world that is founded on a creed, and that creed is set forth with dogmatic and even theological lucidity in the Declaration of Independence. We're going to spend some time talking about the Declaration in some detail. I'll hold up this book, The Revolutionary Words That Forged America, the definitive guide to the Declaration of Independence. As I hold it up for those of you watching online, you can see it's a rather thick book. 450 pages. So will we cover all the pages? No, but we will certainly do our best to dip into some of the things that you would need to know if you really wanted to spend some time studying the Declaration of Independence. It is written by Judge Michael Warren. He has served as the Oklahoma County Circuit Court in Michigan since 2002. He's taught constitutional law, former member of the Michigan State Board. A number of years ago, actually started the nonpartisan nonprofit Patriot Week. There's a link to patriotweek.org. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. He also writes and co-hosts the Patriot Lessons, American History and Civics podcast, and his previous book that we might mention, America's Survival Guide, How to Stop America's Impending Suicide by Reclaiming Our First Principles in History. You notice that we talked about that with our conversation about the book by Gat Sad about suicidal empathy. Also a little bit in our piece that we had last hour on the West is Good, the need for us to recognize that we might be having the suicide of the West if we do not change some of this. So this is an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the Declaration. So Judge Michael Warren, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Thank you, Kerby, so much for this opportunity. I'm really looking forward to it.
This book is an encyclopedia. In our booklet here, we did offer some other booklets that have come out and books that have come out in the past, but when we update this, I'll put your book in there for sure, because I think it's helpful to maybe talk about how this is put together, because in some respects, there is this section that many people know, which relates to the kind of the philosophy and the reasons or the justification for separating from from England. But then near the about middle part of the book, you then go into the more than 24 different abuses that were listed at the time, which, by the way, I think all but 4 of them were in state constitutions, including one I noticed that you crossed out, which was about King George has waged cruel war against human nature, dealing with the issue of slavery. So in some respects, let's talk about the overview for just a minute, because Thomas Jefferson was saying that I didn't come up with anything new. I was pulling some of the ideas that were resident at the time, but between him and the committee, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Robert Livingston, and Roger Sherman, we have today this declaration. But can you give us an overview for just a minute, not only for the declaration, but your book?
Absolutely, and thank you for the opportunity. As you mentioned, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that when any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to establish new government, laying its foundation of such principles and organizing its power such forms to them so seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Those words from the Declaration of Independence were revolutionary in 1776, and they remain revolutionary today. And it defines our founding first principles of the rule of law, unalienable rights, limited government, the social compact, equality, and the right to alter or abolish an oppressive government. That's what makes America, America. It's not as fun as it might be watching, Taylor Swift and her boyfriend, or, the basketball playoffs right now, or any of that kind of stuff. It's those founding first principles. That's what makes America, America. And we have, as you mentioned, we've been losing an understanding of that. We have become very complacent in connection with the blessings of liberty that we have. And actually, there are now people that are vigorously attacking our founding first principles and our history. And so what the book does is it tries to return, center focus on everyone across the country on our fundamental founding charter. And it's a line-by-line review, and in many cases, a word-by-word review of the Declaration. And as you mentioned, it includes the 28 grievances. I welcome jury pools all the time. I give them orientations. When I'm selecting juries, I've had over 400 juries trials, and I usually begin with the Declaration, and I'll ask, why do we declare independence? And I'll get one hand, and they'll say something like, they'll mumble taxation. They don't say taxation without representation, just say taxation. And then you might get quartering the troops. And then you'll get an odd answer here or there that's wrong. And I point out, no, there's 28 reasons why we declared independence. One of them was the suppression of the right to the jury, and that's how I hooked the jury into going, why they should want to serve on the jury. But we are fools to think that if we don't understand the foundations of our freedom and our equality, that we're going to be able to preserve it. And one of the things that I know your show is very focused on is the Creator, and how our rights come from God, not from man, not from government, but we are born with inherent rights which are unalienable. Unalienable means, alienability is an old-fashioned term for being able to sell or transfer. Unalienability, some people say inalienability, that means that you can't transfer or sell those rights. They're born in you as a child of God, and they can't be taken from you by any worldly power. And if people could just remember that, I think our country would be much better off. But the idea is to get folks to understand our common heritage, our common first principles, and then we can hopefully unify in this divisive and toxic environment in a much better way to help our country better fulfill those founding first principles.
Let's take a break. Michael Warren with us, and the illustration used is a great one because I remember years ago I was actually teaching chapel at Dallas Theological Seminary, and I at the time was speaking on the issue of civil disobedience because there was a question about Operation Rescue and a number of other things, and I had a student come up afterwards and say, applying these principles, I don't think I could justify actually supporting the American Revolution and the Declaration because we actually separated from England for imposing taxes without our consent, which is actually the phrase there. And I said, well, actually, if you go back, and I would encourage you to read the Declaration, there's, as you point out, 28 reasons. That's not even one of the more significant ones there. And I think most people think that the only reason we left England was for taxation without representation. If they thought taxation without representation was bad, they should see taxation with representation. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
You've probably heard the phrase, the government giveth and the government taketh away. That's an apt description of taxes and tariffs in 2026. Many Americans have been pleasantly surprised by the tax refunds they received this year because of the tax cuts inserted into the one big, beautiful bill. No taxes on tips, overtime, and Social Security provided many Americans with a significant check from the IRS. Unfortunately, while the government was putting money back in the pockets of U.S. taxpayers with tax refunds, it was also taking money out through tariffs that increase prices that Americans pay. Former Senator Phil Gramm is one of the co-authors of the Trump tax increase of 2026. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that the taxes implemented during the Trump administration will generate $331 billion this year, but the new tax cuts will only save taxpayers $230 billion. One of the themes of this election is affordability. By October, the office estimates that these new tariffs will cost American consumers and businesses $443 billion, while the tax cuts will have provided them $379 billion. One question that is always asked about tariffs is, who pays? The CBO estimates that businesses are absorbing about 30% of the cost of tariffs. Consumers are paying the remaining 70%. Another question is, how will this affect the midterm elections? Defenders of the tariff policies argue that these tax cuts provide new benefits, perhaps, but voters have short memories. Affordability is a major issue, especially with the Iran war's impact on supply chains. The president's tariffs have made prices higher. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, I might just mention, if you'd like to know a little bit more about Judge Michael Warren, you can go to judgemichaelwarren.com. We have a link on the website there and find out more about him, maybe schedule him to speak, or maybe just learn a little bit more about that. Of course, we also have information about the book that you can get in Kindle or paperback, The Revolutionary War Words, I should say, That Forged America, the definitive guide to the Declaration of Independence. And since you began with, of course, this idea we're endowed by our Creator, one of the things, Michael, that we see is that as people are encouraged to read the Declaration, and I'll hold up our booklet right now. We have a booklet that has both the Declaration and Constitution, and it also has some information about point of view, and we're making it available free of charge to anybody that would like to get it. As they read through that, they're saying, I see God a few places here. The idea of the laws of nature and nature's God, that we're endowed by their Creator, then also that the colonists were appealing to the supreme judge of the world, and they also were then calling for protection to divine providence because they were going against the greatest military power of the 18th century. So God is either mentioned implicitly or explicitly 4 times in the Declaration, isn't he?
Absolutely. There's no question. There's been some revisionist history, especially became fashionable in the 60s and 70s, that Jefferson was a deist and that the founding fathers were not particularly religious, and that we could kind of secularize this document. And when I was younger, when I was in high school and college, and even some portion of law school, I kind of tried to read it that way. And I kept reading it and said, no, you cannot do this justice by ignoring the overarching importance of the supreme being. And it's, as you said, there's several different ways that it's phrased, all majestically. And there is no question, and the book spends a great deal of time on this, explaining that the worldview of the founding fathers, there's an exception here or there, is that there is a supreme being. And even Jefferson believed there was a supreme being.
That's right.
He just didn't necessarily believe that Jesus was the Savior and the Messiah. But most of them were, the founding fathers and those that were involved in the Declaration and the Continental Congress were deeply religious men. There were many men that were trained in the ministry or theological schools. There wasn't really much of a debate. The atheists and what they would call Islams or Mohammedists were not taken. They respected them, but they didn't really, there was no pretense of that was the correct worldview. It was certainly Judeo-Christian.
Let's, if we can, maybe get into what oftentimes is referred to the most famous sentence in history, and that is the one you just read off, where we hold these truths to be self-evident, which is chapter 11, that all men are created equal, that's chapter 12, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, chapter 13, and then from there, because that is a very significant statement. It's one that you chose to use to illustrate the Declaration, and it, again, is rooted in history. To understand the Declaration, I can tell that you have taken the time to go back and say, well, there are people like John Locke and William Blackstone, maybe even the Lex Res principle of Samuel Rutherford, and many of these ideas were around at the time, and the genius, I think, of Thomas Jefferson and his committee is they brought them all together in a document that really has stood the test of time, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I'm of course very biased, but I believe that this is the most remarkable non-scriptural document that has been produced by the hands of mankind. And you point out very rightly that it wasn't just, there's this myth that it was just kind of Thomas Jefferson sitting at a desk. There was a committee. We know that there were some changes that were offered by Franklin and Adams. We've kind of lost the history, what exactly there were. Then it goes to the convention, the Congress, and they hack and slack it and slice it up. And Adams rises to its defense and defends every word. Jefferson sulks in the corner, and basically every time they change something, he feels that he has been stabbed by a dagger. And but most of the changes, there's one that you mentioned earlier that you said I struck it out. Well, the Congress struck it out. But other than that one strikeout, almost every change was remarkable and improved the flow and the majesty of the document. And I truly believe that the divine hand of God was in that room, helping those delegates make a document that clearly stands the test of time and is truly immortal.
You know, he did mention that when the one that was, of course, struck out was about slavery, that King George's war waged a cruel war against human nature, and then talks about the slave trade and everything. And unfortunately, that did not stay because of some of the colonists. But I'm glad that you put that in there, because a while back I was watching a video of Glenn Beck, who I have great respect for, and he said, I just discovered the other day that there was actually a statement in the Declaration, and that's chapter 50 of your book, by the way, that was condemning slavery. And I just learned that for the first time. And I thought, well, if somebody as educated as he just learned that, there's a sense in which some people will say, well, what about the founding? They didn't address the issue of slavery. Well, they attempted to do so in a number of different occasions. And of course, there has been an attempt throughout our 250-year period to do a better job of coming back to those words that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. And I appreciate that you put that in there, because it's just a reminder to some that the battle wasn't completed in 1776, but it was eventually resolved, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And you know, we do get a lot of criticism that the founding generation didn't go further in living up to the ideals that they enunciated, you know, that we've talked about. And, you know, that's fair criticism. But the reality is no one in the course of human history up to that time ever founded a nation on the belief that all men are created equal. And we did. And that fundamentally transformed the baseline for what was right and just in the world. And as you mentioned, it served as the motivation for the abolitionists, the suffragettes, the women that were trying to get the vote, and the civil rights struggles. And you know, even today, there's folks that, you know, keep trying to, you know, they're expanding what it means to be equal. And you may or may not agree with their specific viewpoints, but you know, the foundation of the striving to achieve equality and giving everyone due respect of their unalienable rights clearly stems from the Declaration. And as soon as those words were out there, there was a movement for abolitionism where people said, you put it out there, but we know there's slavery, you're being hypocrites, and we need to change the system. And without violent struggle, slavery was abolished in the North relatively quickly. Within, I mean, it could never be quick enough, but within a couple of decades, basically, it was extinct. And the founding generation doesn't get the credit it needs, that it deserves. That's a monumental change in the course of human history. And but for the cotton gin, it probably would have died out in the South of its own accord.
Yes.
And you know, people like Jefferson and Patrick Henry and others, they recognized that they were being hypocrites, and they were betwixt and confused and weren't sure how they should get out of this mess. George Washington emancipated his slaves upon his death. Ben Franklin was a slave owner, became an abolitionist, started an anti-slavery organization in Philadelphia. There's founder after founder that actually put their money where their mouth is.
Yes.
And we should recognize that.
Yeah, Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, John Adams, all those. Well, we need to take a break. When we come back, I thought we might focus on the other part of that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's chapter 17. Chapter 18, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. And then chapter 19, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Again, if you want to know more about the Declaration, well, we're making it available to you. It's free of charge. Simply go to the website, pointofview.net. It is the Declaration and Constitution, a pocketbook form that we are making available, and you can go to the website if you'd like to know more about this book, The Revolutionary Words That Forged America. Go to pointofview.net, and we'll be back right after this.
I'm sure that you've noticed that social media is now filled with information generated by AI. Dramatic descriptions of politicians and music stars supposedly making statements about a current issue, leaning into the microphone, looking into the lens, opponents silenced. It's powerful, it's riveting, and it's all lies. Even several national television networks were recently found using enhanced pictures, meaning manipulated, falsified, literally not giving a true picture. So many liars, so much deception. Where can we turn for truth? Right here. From Kerby and the team at Point of View, we need your support. Please join the Point of View Truth Team today with a monthly gift of $30 or more. Together, we can shine the light of truth and dispel the darkness and deception of this day. Give now at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151, pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, our conversation with Judge Michael Warren, the revolutionary words that forged America, the definitive guide to the Declaration of Independence. Let's open up the phones in case you have a comment or a question. If not, you might just want to sit back and listen, maybe take some notes, but it's a fascinating conversation we're having today. And I thought for just a few minutes, we might, Judge, talk about the idea of deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, because the middle part of your book really gets into that in some detail, because it relates back to this idea of a social compact. I've oftentimes said that the Declaration gives us the why of American government, and the Constitution gives us the how. And you point out that if you go to the Constitution, of course, you see in Article 1, the legislative authority, which is vested in Congress. Article 2, of course, we're talking about the president. And within Article 3, we're talking about judges. We're talking about all sorts of different aspects of that. But the key there, I think you say, is that the American experiment really actualizes the first principle of the social contract and the social compact. It's been called both. And it does seem to me that that goes back to some of the writings that happened at the time, whether it's Hobbes and Locke and Montesquieu and others. Can you kind of develop that for us? Because some people don't see the connection between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I think you do a very good job in your book explaining that.
Well, thank you very much. I have this favorite quote of mine, or not mine, that I put in the book. It's on page 156. It's Thomas Paine, who also was an abolitionist, and from Common Sense, which is really the leading closing argument for the revolution. And he wrote, "Society in every state is a blessing. A government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one. Government-like dress is the badge of lost innocence. The palaces of the kings are built on the ruins of the bowers of paradise. For were the impulses of conscience clear, uniform, and irresistibly obeyed, man would need no other lawgiver. But that not being the case, he finds it necessary to surrender up a part of his property to furnish means for the protection of the rest." And when he says property, he means our rights. Here then is the origin and rise of government, namely, a mode rendered necessary by the inability of moral virtue to govern the world. Here too is the design and end of government, namely freedom and security. So the whole point of having a government, he could write, right? He and Jefferson were fantastic. The whole point of having a government is to ensure the protection of your unalienable rights. And a simple example is, if you're at home and you don't have a police force, you don't have a military, you just have your own home by yourself, and somebody breaks in and beats up your wife and steals your TV or runs down the street, you have if there's no government, your only option is to chase the man down and beat him up in return and extract the TV from him, which is vigilante justice, and ensures, in Hobbes' view, a war of awe against awe. And so we give up some of our rights to allow for the creation of a government to protect our rights. That's the whole point of the government. And I think this is an idea that is lost on almost all current American and world politicians. And if you understand that, then you understand that the government should be limited and that it shouldn't be, have unlimited absolute power. And that's a fundamental principle of American constitutional law, and it's derived from the Declaration. It's laid out there in magical words. And if you understand that, it really forms the basis of protecting our liberties and freedoms.
Well, and the other side of that is that when government has engaged in, I'll use the phrase from the Declaration, a long train of abuses and usurpations, it becomes then the right and the duty to alter or abolish it. Now, again, within the Constitution, there's a way in which you can alter it by the amendment process, or you also talk about a constitutional convention. This was, of course, a desire to abolish that and institute a new government, but that really brings us back to the responsibilities, the rights and responsibilities of every citizen, right?
Absolutely. We believe, or at least we should believe, that we are all children of God, that we are each have, I like to say, a divine spark in us, that a celestial fire, in the words of George Washington,
right,
that resides in us, and we are equal to each other, and by nature, and we have those unalienable rights. And so when we band together, we only give up as much as we need so that we can have security. You don't give up a little bit of your rights to the government and then allow them to have unfettered, unlimited power. That would not be consent of the governed, although Hobbes felt that way. It would be, the creation of a tyranny in lieu of your individual liberties. And so that's fundamental. And one way that we've constitutionalized this idea of being able to reform or abolish a government is elections. And that's why we vote every 2 years for a new House, and every 6 years for a senator, and every 4 years for a president, is because that's a bloodless way to throw the bums out without having to get your pitchforks and your torches. And then, as you mentioned, you can amend the Constitution, or you could convene a constitutional convention. And there's other safeguards, lawsuits, other ways that you can petition the government. You have the freedom of speech, you have the freedom of press, the freedom of association, the freedom of religion. All these ways are to ensure the protection of our freedoms and to allow for the reform of the government without having to go through a revolution.
Well, and one of the things we've talked about on this program is that usually on our Friday we have at least somebody from First Liberty Institute, Kelly Shackelford, or this week we'll have Jeff Mateer, or of course we have people from Alliance Defending Freedom, Lathan Watts and others, and we are right now enjoying greater religious freedom than perhaps ever, because we are seeing some of these precedents that have come down in the past that have been in one way or another limiting the First Amendment, whether it's the establishment of religion, the prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or even the idea of freedom of speech and a variety of others. And so in some respects, it's back to this very key idea that if we find things that we feel are an abuse of the constitutional order, we have a responsibility to bring about this change. Some of that has happened legislatively, certainly by electing the right individuals. Some of it has happened by electing the right individuals that put the right justices in the court to bring about those changes. But it brings us back to one of the key foundational principles in the Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely. And, Jefferson and Madison and others believe that, in the priority of religion, priority of rights, the free exercise of religion was on top, because you have to give your homage and your worship to the divine being, and that's your first priority. It's above everything else. And some people like to say, well, that's why it's in the First Amendment. But actually, the First Amendment was the Third Amendment. Long story.
Yes.
First two didn't get adopted.
Very true.
But it is the first thing in in the Declaration, or excuse me, in the First Amendment. And so it's a fundamental right. It goes to the ability to save your soul, and it should not be let go without fierce opposition. And people have a duty to ensure that they have the ability to worship God in the way that they need to, and they should give everyone the freedom to be able to do that.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I thought for just a minute we might focus on that very long list, 28 different abuses. To illustrate this, again, the booklet we've been making available on the Declaration and Constitution, the first page and a half is the material we sort of covered, and then the next 6 pages are the ongoing list of all the things that the king had abused. And again, it says that we submit these facts to a candid world. And since a very significant part of the Declaration and almost half of your book certainly is on the subject of some of those abuses, I thought we might highlight a few, because so many people think that the only reason we separated from England was due to taxation without representation. There are many other issues there as well, and you have taken the time in a very exhaustive way to look at each one of those abuses that were listed and to talk about those significant abuses. So we're going to come back and talk about that as we continue our conversation on the revolutionary words that forged America. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to know a little bit more about my guest or even about his book, The Revolutionary Words That Forged America, Judge Michael Warren, we have all that information on our website at pointofview.net. But at least half, almost more than half of your book has to do with those 28 different abuses, which are listed in a very significant way, culminating in the idea that really these are acts that define a tyrant. And I thought for just a minute, since you have devoted so much of your book to that, you might mention a few or the significance of those, because the average American, as you certainly have pointed out, when asked why did we even separate from England, the answer you most often get is no taxation without representation. And there are 27 other particular items, not to mention one that was left off on slavery, that certainly need to be mentioned as well, don't they?
Absolutely. So I'll try my best to be concise. The first, and I appreciate this opportunity. The first one is the very first grievance is he has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He is the king, and back then, if a colonial legislature passed a law, it would not become effective unless the king assented to it. In other words, approved it. And the book lays out how there are hundreds and hundreds of laws, including things like dealing with divorce, that like people couldn't get divorced unless the king approved the law, and he refused to approve the law, that really subverted self-government. And one example that I think is just highlights the nuances and complexities of the American Revolution is the slave trade.
Yes.
Virginia wanted to tax it out of existence, so they passed a law to do that. There was another colony that was trying to do the same thing, but the king liked the slave trade, so he said no. And so Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder, is trying to condemn the king, or does condemn the king, for not allowing Virginia to attack the slave trade. I mean, the irony there is rich. Another one is that he obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers.
Yes.
So this was in North Carolina. The colony had this, unlike today, they would pass a law to create a court system. Then it would expire, so it would sunset, and so they had to pass a new law. So they tried to pass a new law, but they wanted to, this gets very technical in the weeds, but basically they wanted to make it easier to collect debts in North Carolina. And the king didn't like that. And so the king refused, and then the court system expired, and there were no courts in North Carolina for several years until the Revolution. So that's insane. He imposed basically a trade embargo. So, we're hearing about the Traité Hormuz. He imposed a trade embargo across the colonies that was devastating to the colonies. As I mentioned before, he changed the rules of the game in connection with jury trials. Normally, if you're accused of a crime, you'd be tried by a jury of your peers in which alleged crime occurred. I'm in the middle of a criminal murder trial right now. I'm on recess, obviously, but my pool is from Oakland County. I think you said Oklahoma, but Oakland County. And that's how it was supposed to work back in the colonial days. When they passed the Tea Tax, the Stamp Act, the Boston Pork Bill, other acts, they knew it was going to be difficult to get convictions. So they made those cases triable by the Admiralty courts, which were in Halifax in Canada or in London in England. So they'd ship people overseas, and they were tried by judges who were appointed by the king and served at his pleasure, which is a fancy way of saying if the king didn't like his decisions, he could fire the judges. So imagine if, Joe Biden or Donald Trump could fire every judge he disagreed with, or your local governor. I mean, it was crazy, but that's what was going on there.
Could suspend the legislature. That was another one.
Yes. So he passed an act. So they closed down the Massachusetts legislature, shut it down totally, and replaced it with a governor. And then initially it was a civilian governor. Then he replaced that guy with a military man. So they basically had a military dictatorship running Massachusetts, a big colony, the hotbed of the American Revolution. But that was part of the reason, was because they had a military dictator running their state. And so, there's what we tend to forget is how violent the revolution was, or the British oppression was before we declared independence. So the king, before we declared independence, said, "You're all rebels, and I'm not protecting you anymore." So he, as I said before, he closed the trade, and then he had his ships attack American vessels. Mm-hmm. He would impress the sailors, take them off, and basically make them slaves of the British Empire to work on the English ships. Then he had the ships attack, and here's the language, he's plundered our seas, ravaged our coast, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people.
Yes.
That all happened. They literally bombarded coastal towns and set them afire. And so he was at war with the colonies before the colonies really were at war with the British Empire. And that's just a smattering of them. So there's, before the Revolution, when they were imposed, this is one that might have some resonance today. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. So he created a whole bunch of bureaucrats, sent them over to America to enforce the Stamp Act and subsequent acts of legislation for taxation. So it was on all fronts, legislative, judicial, taxes, domestic tranquility. It was a ravaging of American liberty.
For sure. And again, ends with, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. And again, this is part of this book, which is The Revolutionary Words That Forged America, the definitive guide to the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, we've only covered some parts of that, but if you'd like to know a little bit more about Judge Michael Warren, you can go to judgemichaelwarren.com. You can find out much more about what he he is doing. And if you would like to contact him, we have that link on the website. Of course, we also have a link to this book, which you can get either in paperback or Kindle. So, Judge, thank you for writing the book, and thank you. I know you're a very busy individual for giving us an hour today to talk about it here on Point of View.
Kerby, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless America.
Well, again, I would encourage you to find out more about this. As we've mentioned before, we've had some of these booklets on the Declaration. Of course, we're making available right now this Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You can simply go to the website, pointofview.net. As you go there, you will see that there is a place where you can get a free booklet. Click on the button that says Get a Free Booklet. You can scroll down. There's a place for you to receive this by digital download. And then we would, of course, need your email. But if you'd like us to mail this to you, and we'd be glad to do so, just make sure that the box that says Receive in the Mail and give us your address. At the same time, you can also sign up to receive the Viewpoints Daily Commentary, which I just read a few minutes ago. Also, you can receive the Pray for America weekly email. So there's some ways in which, as you go to the website, pointofview.net, you can get a free booklet and other resources we would want to put in your hands. We're going to continue educating you about America 250, and this was one of those attempts to do so today with a very good book by Judge Michael Warren. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Megan for her help engineering the program. Steve, thank you for producing the program. We'll see you back here tomorrow right here on Point of View.
Where does moral truth come from? According to 58% of Americans, individuals determine moral truth. A quarter of Generation Z says society determines moral truth, and morality can even change over time. Only 42% of Americans believe that truth comes from God. I don't know about you, but I find these numbers extremely troubling. It really is a crisis of truth, and that crisis has consequences. Look at society. Evil is called good, good called evil. People with biblical beliefs are called bigots, or worse, they're canceled. But there is hope. The Bible promises the truth will set us free, and that's why Point of View is relentless in our commitment to the ultimate source of moral truth, God's Word. At Point of View, we know that God's truth is eternal, and if we stand together, we can help more Americans apply His truth in their daily life. Help Americans find truth again by giving at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.